Okay, well, let's make a start. So, thanks very much for joining us. I'm excited that we're going to get to basically just geek out over anatomy and biomechanics and physiology for an hour. So, firstly, the session we've booked it for 90 minutes, but the actual plan is to go for 60 minutes. So, the 90 minutes is just in case we go over for whatever reason, but the plan is to not go over. The plan is to take 60 minutes. And the session is being recorded, so if your significant other's running around the house in their underwear, tell them to stay off camera. And the only place that the recording's going to appear is in a closed Facebook group for folk who are interested in seeing this, the recording of this. Okay, so the format today is basically I've got a whole huge backlog of questions that I've received offline from people. So I'm going to start out by answering one of those. And then I'm going to just open it up to everyone who's on the call. And if you have a question that you would like to throw at me, type it into the chat. And we're just going to do them on a first come, first served basis. So, the quickest typist gets their question answered first. And if we don't get to your question today, never fear, it'll go on the list and it will get answered in the fullness of time. So, and as we go, you guys are all totally cool with the whole Zoom etiquette thing after a year of COVID. So can see you're all on mute there, which is awesome. But feel free anytime if you have a question, like if part of what I'm saying doesn't make sense to you, or if you've got a contribution that you'd like to make, feel free to just unmute and add in whatever you got to say, or sling it to me in the chat. All right. So, firstly, I have a question from Emily Moffat, which I'm sad to say this came in about, I don't know exactly, but probably 6 weeks ago, I'm going to guess. So, Emily, thanks for your patience bearing with me. So I'm just going to read it out. Now, there are actually sort of 2 or 3 parts to this question. And so I think the first part is a relatively quick answer, and the second part we'll spend a bit more time on. So Emily says, you're saying that telling someone to engage their muscles is far less effective than putting them in a position that will actually engage the muscles, which I can understand. So in terms of my question about learning how to handstand, I could say engage your core, which would help them hold the position and keep the body still, but a more effective thing to do would be to use external cues like push the floor away and reach toes up to the roof and try to keep your body really still. I guess sometimes I find that people's body awareness and proprioception can be poor, and so it may be difficult for them to perceive where their body is in space. So that's sort of part 1 of the question. And that's got a relatively simple answer, which is, Emily, you're 100% correct. When people's body awareness and proprioception is poor, it can be hard to find their place in space. And research really, really clearly shows, in fact, including research on, most of the research has been done on balancing tasks. So we know it's applicable, that the best way, if somebody's got poor proprioception, poor body awareness, and can't find their place in space and balance, the best way to improve that is using external cues. So using cues like, if they've got some kind of footwear on, like shoes or socks or something, keep your shoes still, keep your waistband still. Those types of things are the best types of cues. And interestingly, this has been studied in beginners, in sort of intermediate people who are kind of somewhat skilled, in people who are highly skilled, and in elite professional acrobats. And it's been found to be true for beginners, for intermediate folk, and for advanced folk. But interestingly, in the elite acrobats, it wasn't the case that external cues were more useful. This was a study on where they actually literally had Cirque du Soleil acrobats that they were studying, and the task that they were practicing was standing still on a fitball. Right? Now, if anyone's ever tried to stand on a fitball, it's not as easy as it looks. And but these were people who this was their day job, right? Standing on a fit ball, probably doing a one-handed handstand on a fit ball was more their day job, or standing on a fit ball with 3 people on their shoulders was their day job, or doing a somersault off a trampoline and landing on a fit ball. So, these are people for whom they're very, very close to the maximum genetic potential that they have for, skill in this activity. And so what they found in this particular study with the Cirque du Soleil acrobats was that they tried an external focus cue, which was keep the ball still. Then they tried an internal focus cue, which I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was something like keep your feet still or something like that. And then they tried no cue as a control condition. And what they found was that both the internal cue and the external cue were not as effective as the control condition of just not giving them any instruction. And then after they finished the task, they asked them, okay, so when we didn't give you an instruction, what were you thinking? And the researchers were trying to figure out, were they thinking about an internal cue for themselves, or were they thinking about an external cue for themselves? And the answer was, I wasn't thinking anything. I was just being still. Right? So they didn't have any cue. They were completely in flow, right? They had no thought. And so what the research seems to suggest is basically for anybody who is thinking during what they're doing, thinking about an external focus cue is going to be more effective for learning movement skills. But when you get to that like supremely high level of skill where it's basically as good as a human can get at doing that task, then no instruction is probably the best instruction. So that's very interesting. And the second part of the question, the short answer to that is if you want to get better at doing handstands, unless you're already in Cirque du Soleil, the best cue is going to be something focusing the person's attention on a point outside their body that is related to the movement outcome. So the movement outcome is you stay still in a handstand. And so, part of your clothing keeping still, or the object on which you're balancing keeping still, or something like that, those would be really good cues. Second part of the question is still from Emily, and still about core control. You're talking about how when you do a sit-up, you could cinch the waist in by engaging the transversus abdominis to make it harder, but you didn't think it was necessary, and just about aesthetics of having a smaller waist. I guess my follow-up question to this is, if the only way to strengthen the transversus abdominis is to cinch the waist in, but you saw this as being only for aesthetic purposes, however, you also want a strong transversus abdominis, how would you then suggest to strengthen it without cinching it in when doing ab work? And that is a freaking awesome question. So both of these are really good questions. Thanks, Emily. All right, let's just invoke a little bit of what bits go where anatomy. So if we look from the side view and think about that as being roughly a human spine, and then the rib cage roughly like that. And not sure where all my tools have gone. There they are. And then we think about the placement of the muscle. So can you picture this is the front here? This is the back. We're looking at the side view. Thumbs up if that kind of makes sense, that you can kind of picture what you're looking at. Okay, cool. All right, so if we think about the rectus abdominis, your six-pack muscle, okay, the sort of main power muscle for bending the spine, it runs from about your T5, your fifth rib, down to your symphysis pubis. Symphysis pubis, and that's the pubic bone. I know my pelvis looks more like a Manhattan cocktail glass, but, what are you going to do? Actually, it looks like a cosmopolitan. It's making me think of Sex in the City now. Just fill it up with some – cosmopolitans are sort of purplish, aren't they? All right. So anyway, we digress. So here's your rectus abdominis, okay, and this is a side view. That's pretty much what it looks like. Then you have your transversus abdominis, which runs kind of like that. That's the transversus abdominis. And at the back, so at the front, the transversus abdominis basically connects onto the rectus abdominis. It connects onto the fascia of the rectus abdominis. And at the back, the transversus abdominis connects onto the lumbodorsal fascia. Now, my drawing leaves a bit to be desired because I've got the lumbodorsal fascia about 6 inches from the spine, but, hopefully you get the picture. It's not exactly to scale. So the transverse abdominis cinches around the waist, and I think I've drawn the fibers relatively accurately here in that the upper fibers, angle down a tiny bit, and the middle fibers are very much horizontal, and the lower fibers kind of angle up just a little bit from front to back. So basically the action of the rectus abdominis is to pull those 2 points closer together. Its origin and its insertion, the T5 and the symphysis pubis, closer together, right? And the action of the transversus abdominis is to pull its origin and insertion closer together, which is to pull the lumbodorsal fascia forwards and the rectus abdominis backwards. It cinches your waist in, right? So that's the basic action. Now, so is this all kind of making sense? Do you have a question about this? This is all cool, all right? So now, if we think about, if we were to think about a curl up or a sit up, okay? Well, if you're doing your curl up, okay, here's your rib cage, here's your arms, there's your legs. Okay, and now if we think about the rectus abdominis, okay, well, the rectus abdominis provides about 70% of the force to curl you up. Okay, the obliques collectively provide about 30% of the curling force. And so the rectus abdominis is the main power muscle, and it goes from the T5 to the symphysis pubis. Now, as a muscle contracts, right, the literal meaning of contract is to shorten, right? So to contract and to shorten literally mean the same thing, okay? Now, as you learned in, I don't know, whatever it was, maybe grade 7 physics class or something, the shortest distance between any 2 points is what? Say it in your mind. Do you know the answer to this one? It's a straight line, right? The shortest distance between any 2 points is a straight line, okay? So as you bring your rib cage forwards and your symphysis pubis upwards, well, what happens is the shortest distance between those points moves forward, right? So this distance here increases. The distance between the spine and the rectus abdominis increases. Can you see how that would happen? Because of the curve of the spine and the rectus abdominis there kind of cutting the angle between the two of them, right? So the actual biomechanics of how this muscle works dictates that in order to maximally shorten, in other words, in order to be as efficient and effective as possible, it's got to basically push forwards. Does that kind of make sense? Now, where's my eraser gone? There it is. So now, when you do your curl up though, it's not just the rectus abdominis that's working, it's all of your abs that are working. And so we have the transversus abdominis, which goes this way, okay? And its action is the exact opposite of what we just said, okay? Its action is to pull that rectus abdominis in towards the spine, right? So it directly opposes that movement of the rectus abdominis. So when you curl up, the more you activate your transversus abdominis, okay, the more you end up not having this straight line here, but instead having more of a curve like that. And you're looking at that and thinking, that looks much prettier, like I want to look on Instagram from the side view when I'm doing my curl up, okay? Well, the shortest distance between any 2 points is a straight line, and we no longer have a straight line there, right? So we don't have the shortest distance between those 2 points. In other words, we have inhibited the rectus abdominis from its most efficient biomechanical function there. Does that make sense to you? Anyone have a question about that? You cool? All right. So that's why increasing the activation of your transverse abdominis in a curl up just decreases the efficiency of the movement, right? So it's not that you should not contract it at all. It's just like, let your brain figure out how much to contract it, because you want to contract it a little bit so that everything kind of stays in the right place, but you don't want to overly contract it. So it needs to contract a certain amount, but not infinitely. The next thing is the last part of the question is, well, you want to have, so that's why I wouldn't cue contract your transversus abdominis in a roll up, because all you're going to do is make the movement less efficient. So then the last part of the question was basically, well, how would you strengthen transversus abdominis if you're not going to cue it in a roll up, and pulling it in is the way to strengthen it. How would you strengthen it? Well, let me digress just for a moment, and we're just about done with this answer. If we think about the anatomy from the front view now, right? So here's your spine from the front view. Here's your pelvis, sacrum. Looks like a very small elephant with two big ears. There's your rib cage. All right, there's your femurs, etc. We don't need to get any more detailed than that. All right, so if we think about this from the front view now. So again, here's the rectus abdominis. It goes from your T5 to the symphysis pubis, and you've got a left and a right rectus abdominis. That's why you have a 6-pack instead of a 3-pack, right? Because just like every muscle in your body, just about, you've got a left and a right of it. So you've got a left and a right rectus abdominis. Then we said you've got your transversus abdominis, and the fibers of that run horizontally. And that's a very nice little neat right angle alignment. And then you have, and I'm just going to draw these in a slightly different color so there's a little bit of contrast. Then you have your external obliques. And the external obliques, maybe we'll pick a slightly different, more prominent color. The external obliques fibers run diagonally like so, from top and lateral to bottom and medial. They run down and in, basically. And then you've got your internal obliques, which run at right angles to the external obliques. So you can see that the right, maybe if I choose even a different color here, the right internal oblique, internal oblique, and this one here is external oblique, okay? You can see that the right internal oblique and the right external oblique run at right angles to each other, right? And the left internal and the left external run at right angles to each other as well. And then the left internal oblique here and the right external oblique, they're parallel, right? They run in parallel there, the fibers. So what we basically have is this really nifty shape, which is basically, it's a crosshatch, right? It goes like this, and it goes like this, and it goes like this, and it goes like that. So that's your abs, right? Now, if you wanted to hold this stable, still, right, that is the best possible arrangement of those muscles, right? There is no better way that you could arrange those muscles for them to hold that area still, like if you're loading it heavily with like lifting up something heavy or whatever. And so just imagine now if we change the context, right, and make this, instead of a human skeleton, right, let's make it a blanket, okay, and you're standing on the 14th floor of a building that's burning, okay, and you've got some firemen here. There's the fireman, there's his hat. There's another fireman, you can see them from the top. There's his hat, okay. There are two more firemen holding the blanket. There are two more firemen holding the blanket. There are two more firemen holding the blanket, okay. Now these two firemen are going to pull the blanket this way. These two are going to pull it this way, and so on and so on. Now you're about to jump 14 floors into this blanket. Which two firemen are the most important for stabilizing the blanket? Can you picture it? Which two firemen are the ones that need to pull hard in order for that blanket to be the most stable it could be, so that you don't bounce off it and fall on the ground? It's a trick question, right? Because, of course, you'd want all the firemen to pull equally hard in order for that blanket to be as stable as possible. Does that make sense to you? Thumbs up if it does. Like, you'd want all the firemen to pull, right? So when you want to hold your spine still, like when you do a loaded squat or a plank or anything where you're working to hold your spine, and rib cage and pelvis still, right? Which muscles do you activate in your abs? The answer is all of them, right? And so the harder these guys pull, right? Well, that's going to distort the blanket, isn't it? If just these two guys pull. So what's going to happen is these guys have to pull equally hard in order to counteract that. And same with these ones and these ones. Can you imagine if one pair just pulled harder than everybody else, would kind of crease along the middle, the blanket, right? So in order to keep it evenly tensioned, all of them have got to pull equally. So any exercise, right? And of course, we now can go back to thinking of this as your rectus abdominis, right? Any exercise that tensions the rectus abdominis is going to tension, guess what? The transverse abdominis and the obliques proportionately, right? So the more you recruit one, the more you recruit all. So basically any kind of plank or anything that loads your torso in a way that you've got to basically brace and hold is going to tension all of those muscles, and that's going to strengthen all of them without necessarily needing to cue any of them. So, Emily, I hope that satisfies.
Hey, Raph, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Thank you so much for spending so much time on answering that question. I just had one final follow-up, which I hope is a very simple sort of like yes-no thing, is I guess just applying that into like a conditioning, sort of if you think about like a hollow body position for like gymnastics conditioning and that sort of thing. And they talk about sort of, trying to flatten through the abdominals to gain more control through the movement. And that's the ideal positioning of having a hollow body or a scooped in rectus abdominis as being stronger and having more control over movements. I guess, is that correct?
Well, based on the biomechanics, no, it's not. But I mean, I don't know much about gymnastics. I'm not a gymnast and I'm not a gymnastics coach, but I would guess that maybe there's an aesthetic consideration within gymnastics, is that you want it to look a certain way, right? That's it's an aesthetic sport. Your arms need to be straight, you need to stick your chest out and all these things. So I imagine that maybe within gymnastics, getting strong in that hollow body position is important, and thus you should train it, right? And if the cue is suck your tummy in, well, that's fine. But I guess I would say don't confuse the goal of being good at that particular technique in gymnastics, which involves an aesthetic component, right? Don't confuse that goal with the goal of being as strong as possible in that position, right? Because to be as strong as possible, you shouldn't preference one muscle over the other. You should invoke the synergistic, activation of all of them.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right. So we have quite a few questions here. First question is from Naoko, and she says, I have a 25-year-old cerebral palsy client who has very weak and tight left side. So that's not a question, it's a statement, but I'm assuming the question is, what would you do for that? Is that correct, Naoko? How would you approach that?
Yes, I'm trying to figure it out. His hands are very tight and the fist doesn't open up easily. And his left is very weak, left leg. So I have using a chair to strengthening his leg. But when I try to target my hand, I just try to make him target my hand to open up and tap my hand, things like that. Very, very hard to open it.
Yes.
But he will do it, and then he will use the roll down bar to roll down. But it's one side stronger than others. So how can I progress that?
Great question. All right. So cerebral palsy is a condition that basically results, as I understand it, from issues during childbirth or very, very late pregnancy, where the baby has insufficient blood supply to the brain for some short period of time, that causes some damage to the motor system, basically. So intellectually, these people I think are fine, but it's like they lose control or some degree of control to some parts of their body. So yeah, that's kind of the high level overview of what cerebral palsy is, and the symptoms are muscle wasting because the innervation to those muscles is lessened. So the parts of the brain that are involved in turning on the leg muscle, for example, have been damaged, right? So not all of the leg muscles get the signal when you say, hey, push that leg away. Not all of the muscles get the message because some of the parts of the brain that are supposed to send those messages don't exist anymore or aren't functioning properly. So then you get muscle wastage in those areas that aren't innervated properly. And then in other muscles, you get a spinal reflex, which causes what's called a flexion contracture. And so basically it flexes a joint. It could be the fingers, it can be the forearms, it can be the shoulders, it can be, the hips, it can be, lots of different joints depending on which part of the brain is involved. And basically it's a spinal reflex which sends that into basically a rigid, contracted position. And because it's a spinal reflex, there's a kind of a hack that you can use to help the person lengthen out through those areas. And so what it is basically you go really, really slowly, right? Because the myotatic reflex, the stretch reflex in the spine, is basically it's the reflex that when the doctor hits you on the knee and your leg kicks up, okay? And what that reflex is when it feels a quick shortening of those fibers, it basically turns on those fibers and resists the lengthening, sorry. So if you try and open quickly, you just basically turn the reflex on even higher and it makes it contract even more, right? Whereas if you go slowly, it kind of like doesn't trigger that reflex, right? So you might find, we probably will find that's a lot easier for him to stretch out if you do it really slowly, right? Really slowly. And it's not a case of you just stretch it out once and then it'll be fine. It's like you're going to have to do that every session for the rest of his life, right? Because that's a central nervous system mediated situation. So yeah, work slowly. The strengthening thing, the muscle fibers are fine. It's actually the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord, that's not generating a signal to those muscle fibers. But the great news is you can improve strength, right? And that's going to be partly by improving the strength of the muscle fibers that are innervated, okay? And partly by just practicing those movements and practicing recruiting those muscles, the brain will, to some degree, rewire itself and go, this brain area is not working, but we'll kind of go around and, use a different brain area to innervate those muscles. Now, it'll never be 100%, recovery, but you definitely should be able to significantly improve strength. And if you just go up on YouTube and do a quick search, there are all kinds of videos of people with like severe cerebral palsy deadlifting double their body weight and, all kinds of stuff. So people with cerebral palsy can really have amazing, improvements in their fitness and functional ability. So I would say those two things: keep strengthening and focus on, I would say, unilateral strengthening. So just work the weaker leg independently and then work the stronger leg at the level of the stronger leg, because you don't want to bring the strong leg down to the level of the weak leg, right? You want to make the strong leg even stronger and the weak leg even stronger as well, right? So you're going to have to work them separately. All right. I have another question here from Melissa. And Melissa says, what is the difference between Pilates and other exercise? Sometimes it feels like there is this secret code around Pilates. When you do a PT session, it seems it's a bit more straightforward. There's a lot of Pilates snobs around. Sometimes I want to tell them to shut up and go and do a mixed cardio session and some weights. All right. So what is the difference between Pilates and other exercise? So, all right. Well, I think on a physiological, there are probably three layers that I could answer this on. The first one is or just if you kind of look at Pilates and then look at something like personal training, what are the differences? Well, I think about this a fair bit actually when I'm scrolling through Instagram, and I look at people doing Pilates on Instagram, and like you can kind of tell often they're moving slowly and they're going for this kind of graceful look, right? You know, like everything's kind of straight, but maybe the ballet fingers, you know, and legs are straight and, you know, and toes are pointed and generally, not always, but generally the movement is kind of slow and controlled. And, you know, I'm generalizing and not everybody, this doesn't apply to everybody doing Pilates, but I think that's my impression anyway. Whereas when I look at people doing personal training on Instagram, I see them doing these much faster movements with kind of a stereotyped, you know, athletic kind of look where they kind of do these, like they love doing these ones. Or they do all kinds of, you know, things like, you know, side lunges or whatever, but they're all into these kind of marching sort of movements where you step up onto a thing or step down onto a thing or lift a weight or whatever, but it's always with a march because that's sort of athletic. So, you know, and I'm sorry, I'm tarring all personal trainers and Pilates people with one brush, and I know that there are exceptions, but that's just my totally unscientific impression from scrolling through Facebook around the culture of how you know, should look or whatever when you're doing Pilates versus personal training. And a lot of the moves are actually very similar, right? If you do a lunge on the ground, well, what makes it Pilates in one class versus personal training in another class versus Zenga in another class versus, you know, Les Mills in another class? Like it's a lunge is a lunge is a lunge is a lunge, right? So you're working the same muscle groups. But okay, so what makes it Pilates or personal training in that particular context, I think, is just like the movement style, right? The aesthetic of it. So that's one thing. You know, Pilates, we tend to like to have little itty bitty weights, you know, in pastel colors. Personal training, we like to have bigger weights, typically black. You know, personal training, we like to use battle ropes. Pilates, we like to use flex bands. You know, so there are a lot of little kind of, I don't know, cultural, fashion sort of accessories and movement styles that go to differentiate them. All right, so in terms of, and also the outfits, right? The outfit you wear to Pilates is not the same as the outfit you wear to your personal training session necessarily. Although there's overlap there. All right, so now in terms of just like the physical differences, well, I think, typically in Pilates, you know, and this doesn't apply to everybody and depends on if you're going to KX, it's different to if you're going to a more traditional, you know, classical Pilates studio. So obviously there's variety there. But I think typically in Pilates, if we kind of take KX Pilates, you know, out of the equation, it's much more focused on low load and movement quality, so moving smoothly and with fluidity and grace and control, and, you know, range of motion, you know, rather than, you know, reaching fatigue in certain muscle groups. Whereas in personal training, it's all about let's blast your delts or let's blast your quads or let's blast your abs or let's blast your glutes. Now, we do a bit of that in Pilates as well, and some of that is sneaked in, but I think it's much more the case in personal training. So, you know, physiologically, could you do a Pilates class where you blast your delts and your glutes and your quads and your abs? Sure. I mean, that's KX Pilates, right? That's what you do there. And there's lots of other studios and styles that will do that as well. So I think, you know, the bottom line is in physiologically, depends how you teach it, but basically there's minimal to no differences, right? Your muscles don't know whether they're working against a spring or against a barbell, right? They can't tell the difference. They just know there's tension, right? And tension is tension. So you're going to get stronger one way or the other. But lastly, I think there is a massive difference in one dimension, and that is the dimension of flow. And this I really got from my conversation with John Steele, the author of Caged Lion. Everybody who knows Chloe, quickly do a push-up, where he was taught by Joseph Pilates directly. He's in his late 80s now, John Steele, and lives in Southern California. And he was taught by Joseph in New York in Joseph's gym from 1962 to 1964 or 5. And his description, you know, he's got this very rich description of doing Pilates with Joseph Pilates. And it was it was this fiercely concentrated mental effort to memorize and move through the routine with, trying to move through it with perfect poise and skill, right? With absolute perfection. And so it was this emphasis was not on how hard or not hard you worked. The emphasis was on trying to do it perfectly and be graceful, transitioning from that little ritual transitions from one exercise to the next. So it was like a dance, or it was like a yoga practice where a flow yoga practice where you're flowing from one move to the next. And so you get into flow. You get into that flow state where you are not thinking, where you're just existing in the moment and you're out of your mind. You have no thoughts. And I hope you've all had the glorious experience of being in that state, right? When you're working on something that is really challenging and you're just like in the zone doing, whether that's a physical thing or working on a project or, whatever it was, right? Thumbs up if you've had a flow experience, right? Well, I think that is what Pilates, at its best, brings us to, is that, and that's why we all say, it's good for my mind, not just my body, right? It calms me down. It gets me out of my stress. It stops my monkey brain, right? So I think that to me is the key difference with Pilates and PT. Yeah, so I hope that answers your question, Melissa. Lindy has a question on scoliosis. Lindy says, can you change the spine by strengthening the muscles either side? One side in scoliosis will obviously be stronger. As far as I've been researching, you can't, but you can strengthen the back muscles and potentially prevent further change. But I have been told by a colleague who has a degree in sports science that you can change the spine. What is the real truth? I think, Lindy, on this one, the short answer is no, you can't. And the slightly longer answer is we're not really 100% certain and you probably can't. So there's quite a bit of literature on scoliosis is a sideways curvature of the spine. Actually, it's not just a sideways, it's any what's quote excessive curvature of the spine, which typically is sideways one way or both ways, but can be forwards to backwards as well. And there's no 100% consensus on the definition of what's excessive. So people who've got 1 degree less curvature are quite normal, and people who've got 1 degree more curvature are scoliotic. But a lot of people quote the figure of 10 degrees, 10 degrees more curved than the average. Okay. So there's most scoliosis, the vast majority, over 90% of scoliosis is what's called adolescent idiopathic, which means that it onsets in adolescence, between the ages of 12 and 19. And it's idiopathic, which is I love the word idiopathic because it's a 5-syllable word, right? That sounds really freaking scientific, but what it means is we don't know what it causes it, right? So it's a really freaking intellectual sounding word for dunno, right? Right. But it sounds much more intelligent when you say idiopathic. Oh yes, I diagnose your scoliosis as idiopathic rather than, I've got no freaking idea why you've got scoliosis. It means the same thing, right? But, there you go. So not over 90% of scoliosis is adolescent idiopathic. So it onsets in adolescence for unknown reasons, right? So that should already start to tell us that we really know next to nothing about this condition and we don't have a good handle on it, right? So if we don't know what causes it, we're very unlikely to know what can reverse it. There's a lot of research on it in adolescence, so looking at adolescent people with scoliosis. And most of that research is not on exercise, though. It's on bracing, wearing literally like a corset, to brace. It's on surgery, spinal fusion surgery. There's a little bit on exercise in adolescence. And the sort of flavor of the literature in adolescence is that exercise does seem to be able to help either slow down progression or stop, or in some cases slightly reverse the progression of the curve if you catch them during adolescence. right? Because in adolescence, the skeleton is not yet fully mature. Your growth plates are still open. The skeleton is still developing. So you've kind of got a window to influence the nature of that growth to a certain extent. Well, that's the thinking. And so in adolescence, we see that, yeah, we probably can influence the progression of scoliosis. It's not clear from the literature if there's any particular form or approach of exercise that's better than any others, right? So there are lots of different kind of proprietary methods for scoliosis exercise, and some of them involve, strengthening the weak side and stretching the short side, and other ones involve like three-dimensional breathing both ways, and some of them involve, axial lengthening exercises, and some of them involve postural adjustments. So there's all different forms of exercise, and they all seem to confer some kind of benefit. And none of them has been shown to be superior or dangerous or anything. Like, they all seem to be equally effective, right? But then so I would say if you've got an adolescent who's scoliotic and wants to be less scoliotic, well, there's a possibility that they could achieve that if they start work now and if they do some exercise, and probably any form of exercise is going to be equally good. Once you're skeletally mature, like as an adult, in your early 20s, the literature is almost non-existent. And what literature there is basically it's garbage level of quality. Really, really poorly designed studies with lots of bias, poor sampling, poor experimental design, no active control group, like you name it. Think of any problem you could have with research, and it's basically that applies to most of the scoliosis research in adults. So I think it's very, very safe to say that in adults, there's absolutely no good evidence that we can do anything about changing people's scoliosis curve. But in adolescents, there's probably reasonable evidence that we can. In adults, we can backtrack a couple of steps and go, okay, well, we want to change the scoliosis. Well, why? Does scoliosis cause pain? And the answer to that is, well, no one's really studied it very much. So we don't really know whether it does or not. There are some studies that find that, we just kind of go and find 200 people with scoliosis and ask them about, do they have back pain? Then we find 200 people without scoliosis who are the same age, gender, socioeconomic status, whatever, and ask them about their back pain. And then are there the same levels of back pain in those two groups? And some studies find that the scoliosis group has more prevalent back pain. Other studies find they have the same levels of back pain as people without scoliosis. So kind of the jury's out on, does scoliosis cause back pain? Although the studies that find that scoliosis is associated with greater levels of back pain find that the actual amount of back pain that is increased in people with scoliosis is so small that it's actually below what's called the minimum clinically important difference. So in other words, like, just say if you had a back pain and it was, a 6 out of 10 pain, right? 10 being the worst possible pain you could imagine, 1 being no pain at all, right? And just say you come and did exercises with me for 6 weeks and we did some stretches and some this and that and the other. And at the end of the 6 weeks, your 6 out of 10 pain had gone down to like 5.95 pain, 5.95 out of 10, right? So I got you a massive 0.05 points out of 10 pain reduction, right? That wouldn't be meaningful, right? So it's different. It's less, right? But it's so little less that it's like, who freaking cares? I paid you $100, a session for 6 weeks for that. And that's what we find in scoliosis, is that the studies that find that people with scoliosis have more pain find they have such a small amount more pain that is actually below what's called the minimum clinically important difference. So the people wouldn't notice if you took the pain away. Basically, it's so small. And can we change it? Can we change scoliosis with exercise? In adults, probably not, but who knows, because the research is all crap. And if we change the scoliosis, would that change their pain? Well, we don't even know they've got pain in the first place, and we don't know if we can change the scoliosis. So the answer to that is we don't know. Can you change people's posture with exercise? Putting scoliosis aside, the literature is mixed on that as well. So there are some studies that have found, yes, you can change people's posture by strengthening exercises and things like that. And other studies that have found it's made no difference. So again, that's a question mark. So sorry. Sorry, there's not a lot of certainty there. Amy has a question. Hey, Raph, I don't know if this is actually relevant to this group because there may be more for people here, but I just wanted to know about employment after diploma and what job opportunities or environments we could work in, working alongside physios in physio clinics. Like, how much trust would clients have in us? Wouldn't they just go to a physio if they have an injury? And once they are cleared to do Pilates, would they just go to a group class? What an awesome question. Yeah, this is a total great question for this group, Amy. So, and I don't think there's one answer to this because it depends on the physio, right? And it depends on the culture in the workplace. So there are certainly a lot of physios now teaching Pilates. And so if you open a Pilates studio 3 doors up from a physio clinic and that physio clinic also offers Pilates, well, they're not going to be referring their clients to you, right? So it's like, that's just a business from a business perspective. They want to keep those clients, paying them the class money, not paying them to you. So that's why physios offer Pilates, right? Because you go to a physio, you got a sore knee or whatever. 10 sessions later, your health fund rebate runs out, and so you're like, oh, well, those sessions were costing me $20 a session with my health fund rebate. Now they're costing me $100 a session. So I'll see you next year, physio. And the physio is like, oh, but wait, you can keep coming and doing Pilates because you need to keep strengthening and everyone needs to do that. So let's get you on Pilates. And Pilates is $25 a session. So it's the same price you've been paying for your physio sessions. So that's kind of the business model that physios do. And I think it's a great business model. I'm not having a go at physios for that. I think it's great to strengthen people and, they're basically running a Pilates studio. But that means that they've got a business incentive not to send you their clients, right? So regardless of how good you are, they're not going to send you their clients. But if you get a job within a physio clinic, right, because these physio clinics are offering Pilates, but guess what? If in physio school, they don't teach you how to teach Pilates, right? So just because you're a physio doesn't mean you can teach Pilates. And a lot of physio clinics are finding that their physios, even the ones trained in Pilates, are not the best Pilates instructors. In fact, the best Pilates instructors, like as defined by like their clients keep coming back and get great results, right? The best Pilates instructors are Pilates instructors. So I know many physio clinics and osteo clinics that teach Pilates, but the Pilates teachers are not physios or osteos. They're Pilates instructors. In fact, Venus, who is one of our trainers, was head of clinical Pilates at Premier Sports and Spinal Medicine for a number of years, and they have a number of studios around Melbourne here. They're an allied health clinic. They've got osteos and physios and podiatrists and all of the rest of it. And their Pilates program is run by people who are non-allied health professionals who are Pilates specialists, right? So that was a really nice synergistic kind of workplace. And I think that if you can find the right workplace, you will find a place for yourself. I think that the last part of your question, would clients trust a Pilates instructor? Wouldn't they just go to a physio? In my experience, that's not the case. I think more commonly clients, I think Pilates has got a great brand when it comes to back pain and things like that. It does come to mind when people think of back pain. Oh, I should do Pilates. And I think people have more trust in individual practitioners than they do in a profession. I'm sure that if you needed to go to a doctor, right, for something serious, you wouldn't just pick the first one on Google, right? You would look for a recommendation from a friend. You would look at reviews. You would look, for somebody with a good reputation. So you're looking for somebody, regardless of their qualifications, who's got that element of trust. And so it then becomes, well, how do you build up that element of trust? And that becomes about your branding and the reviews that you get from your clients and the way that you present yourself, and just the way that you interact with that person. Like, I mean, if I ring you up and I'm a client and I want a session, right, and and the phone rings out and there's no message service, it's like, well, that doesn't leave me a good impression. Or if I go to your website and there's nowhere for me to click to send a message to you or whatever, and if it looks professional and caring and whatever, like, you're going to have a more chance. So hope that helps. So we're going to finish up in 10 minutes, which means I've got about 8 minutes now for one or two more questions. I'm not sure if I'm going to get to all of them, but if we don't get to your question, we will keep a note of it and I will bring it back next time. So if you do have anything else that's burning a hole in your brain, whack it in now. There's another question from Emily, which is a question about activation of muscles. I've watched your anatomy video about not cueing activating glutes or any other muscle, and I understand it does not equal strength. However, surely there would be other reasons to cue activation other than to strengthen. For example, I'm specifically thinking about cueing engaging the glutes in a back bend. This is big in the yoga world to help relieve discomfort in the lower back. Also cueing abdominals in specific positions, not to strengthen, but to offer more support, change the load, feel better in their body. All right, so let's think about, basically the question is is there, other than strengthening, is there a reason to cue specific muscles, in any situation, like for instance, to alleviate discomfort or whatever? My take on, the glute activation in back bending, for example, because I know that like back bending is something a lot of people have physical discomfort with. Like hands up if you do a back bend and you get kind of like a jammy sensation in your lower back, you feel like it's kind of pinching or whatever. It's like, that's pretty common. I get that. But then you do a few back bends and it starts to ease off after, and so that's pretty normal, but it's, it can be kind of concerning for people when they do it for the first time and that, they're kind of worried about their back, or it can also just be distracting. Like if it's kind of like super uncomfortable, it's like you just want to get rid of that sensation so you can enjoy your back bend more. So I think my interpretation of, so I don't know that, activating your glutes particularly helps alleviate that discomfort. But I wouldn't be surprised if sometimes activating your glutes help to alleviate the discomfort, probably through two mechanisms. One is just distraction. Anyone who's ever had a young child that came in with a scraped knee, right, will know that distraction, cures a lot of ills, right? And that's been shown experimentally in adults as well, when we have experimentally induced pain, that if we distract people by playing video games or whatever, that they report the pain is less, right? So we know that distraction, reduces pain. And if you're focusing on how much your back hurts, it's going to hurt more. Whereas if you're focusing on tensing your glutes, you're thinking about tensing your glutes, so you're not thinking about your back, so you're distracted from your back, so it would probably hurt less. And by that logic, you could equally focus on looking at a bird out the window or thinking about your favourite song or reciting the alphabet backwards, and that would have the same effect, right? So that's an experiment you could run, right, to see if that proved to be the case. The second mechanism that I suspect might be operating there in when people feel less discomfort from activating their glutes in a back bend is the well-known analgesic effect of isometric exercise. So, now it's well known that it's a thing, but it's very, very poorly understood about why it's a thing. And so isometric exercise is just when you basically contract a muscle without moving. So like a plank, for example. And it's been pretty well established that when you do isometric exercise, in some circumstances, it can alleviate pain in the body. And so this was first studied in the shoulder and rotator cuff issues. And so people would, physios would prescribe isometric exercise where basically you push your hand against the wall or something, isometrically. And so you're working your rotator cuff isometrically, and you do that for 15 seconds and then, shoulder feels better, right? And it's only temporary. It doesn't last forever, but for a few minutes, your shoulder feels better. And then the scientists got really curious with this and they thought, I wonder if we activated the other arm, the uninjured arm, if that would alleviate the pain on this side. It turns out it does, right? So it's not necessarily doing something to the muscle that you're activating, right? There's something about isometric contractions that does something probably to your central nervous system that is analgesic, reduces pain, right? So, and now it's been studied in other areas of the body, and we know that, doing, for instance, a wall sit, where you isometrically activate your quads, right, can alleviate shoulder pain, right? Squeezing one leg can alleviate pain in the other knee and stuff. So, that's fairly well established, and it doesn't work for all people at all times, but, it's fairly reliable for a lot of people that a 15 or 20 second isometric squeeze will reduce your pain. So that might be another mechanism by which squeezing your glutes could reduce pain in the back bend. So that, most of that's kind of speculation, but I hope it helps. And, so would I be cueing it? I don't know. I think it's a matter of personal preference there. I would probably more go for distraction, okay, or choose some other cue.
Do you not think that when you're in a back bend, though, to have more of a sort of uniform curve, and because you are extending your hips, you need to activate the glutes more because you're extending the hips?
Well, if you wanted to get a more even curve or more hip extension, I would use external cues to achieve that. So like bring the front of your pants legs towards the floor, or lift your waistband up, or make the back of your T-shirt more of a C shape, or, something like that. Lengthen your collar, of your shirt away from your waistband of your pants or something like that. So, using external cues will achieve that more effectively. And, part of what happens when you cue that and when you get that shape that you're after will possibly be increased activation of glutes, right? But there's going to be a whole bunch of other things that go along with that. So if you want to, create that particular shape, well, you're going to want more hip extension. Okay, so you've got to increase the activation of your glutes, but probably also your hamstrings because they're hip extensors, right? And possibly even in deep hip extension, adductor magnus might assist in hip extension, right? And then you've got to reduce the recruitment of all of those muscles on the anterior of the pelvis, the hip flexors and all of that jazz. Now, typically when you activate your glutes, like if you kind of just sit here now and activate your glutes, typically your lower abs kind of are recruited at the same time, right? Not always, but typically if you squeeze your bum, like you kind of squeeze your lower abs at the same time. And squeezing your lower abs is going to take you out of the back bend and reduce that shape, right? So what you want is to recruit your glutes and your hamstrings and possibly your adductor magnus and turn down or deactivate the abs and the hip flexors, right? And so that's a pretty complex, motor program that you're trying to run there, not to mention at the same time you're trying to push into the ground and activate your spinal extensors and all of that, open up your intercostal muscles and pectorals and whatever. So it's a really complex, series of instructions that your brain needs to send to those muscles, and activate the glutes is only one little part of that. And if you focus on that, you might, easily miss a lot of the nuance of all of those other bits. Whereas if you just say, hey, here's the shape we're going for, can you push the front of your pants forward more or something, the brain or the motor cortex will figure out what the best strategy is in terms of muscles turning off and on and whatever. All right, so we are out of time. And we need to finish up, and I just need to let you know that it's so awesome to have you here, and I'm really happy to hang out with you. And all questions are great questions, and there are no bad questions here. And this recording will be posted in a Facebook group, which is a free group. It's just, if you want to watch the recordings, that's where we're sticking them. And we'll send you an email with a link to that so you can watch this again if I don't know why you would want to, but just say you were half asleep during this and you wanted to check it later. And each week we'll be doing this again, and you'll receive an email with a link to next week's if you want to join us or if you've got a question. And if you can't make it to next week's, join the Facebook group and you can watch the recording or any part of the recording that is of interest to you. And by the way, I imagine all of you guys know it, but I've got a podcast with Chloe, and if you found this interesting, go listen to the Pilates Elephants podcast, because this is basically what we talk about most of the time. So, hope you have an awesome rest of the day wherever you are in the world, and see you soon. Bye.